There are moments in history when the internal fissures of a state, usually hidden beneath layers of ceremony and control, become visible to the world. What you are about to hear is a close, measured look at one such moment, a period in which reports of infighting inside Iran's ruling establishment have taken on outsized importance both for people inside the country and for governments across the region and around the globe. Kiron Skinner, an American political scientist and foreign policy analyst, has been speaking publicly about those reports. Her commentary provides a prism through which to examine a larger set of observations, how a revolutionary state manages the pressures of war, economic collapse, generational change, and the centrifugal ambitions of institutions that were built to protect the regime but may now strain it. This voiceover will map out those pressures, explain the competing centers of authority inside the Islamic Republic, and assess the practical stakes of a leadership dispute in Tehran. To begin, it is important to recognize the basic architecture of power inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. Formal institutions, the presidency, the cabinet, the parliament, sit alongside religious authorities and powerful security organs. At the apex is the office of the supreme religious leader, a position that combines spiritual authority with direct control over key institutions. Below that, the judiciary and the guardian council exert constitutional and ideological control. The assembly of experts is charged with oversight of the supreme leadership, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, sits as a parallel military, political, and economic actor with its own chain of command, resources, and regional networks. These multiple centers of power are not a flaw in themselves. They were designed to balance and safeguard the revolution, but they are also a source of friction when pressures rise. In recent months, observers have flagged a shift in the tone and texture of elite politics in Tehran. Where once the regime's public posture projected unanimity, there are now persistent reports of disagreement about how to respond to external military pressure, how to manage the economy, and who should have ultimate responsibility for strategy and appointments. Some accounts describe a tug-of-war between clerical figures and military commanders. Others suggest friction between establishment conservatives and pragmatic administrators who favor a different set of economic priorities. Whatever the precise mix of actors, what matters for analysis is not the label attached to each player, but the functional consequence, crowded decision-making, overlapping authorities, and competing claims to legitimacy. Kiron Skinner's commentary is useful because she places these reports within a broader pattern of modern authoritarian governance. Even tightly controlled systems can fragment when the costs of policy rise and the benefits of unity fall. Leaders who once commanded loyalty through patronage and ideological framing can find that those levers are less effective under the strain of war, crippling sanctions, or sustained military losses. When the security services, in this case the IRGC, begin exercising de facto influence over civilian appointments or regional strategy, the result is often a reordering of priorities. The practical question becomes whether this reordering is a temporary tactical shift, a deeper structural transformation, or a prelude to a more open contest over who directs the state. Another pattern to note is the institutional self-preservation instinct. When the center appears weak, institutions with independent capabilities will act to secure their own survival. The IRGC controls large financial networks, private companies, and armed formations beyond Iran's borders. The clerical establishment controls seminaries and loyalty among religious cadres. For those institutions, loss of influence is not merely political. It is an existential threat to the networks that sustain them, that drives behavior, efforts to consolidate power, to insulate command structures, and to sideline rivals. To outside observers, these moves can look like infighting. To insiders, they may look like necessary steps to prevent collapse. The consequences of elite fragmentation are both domestic and international. At home, uncertainty at the top tends to produce harsher measures against dissent. When rulers fear that their authority is slipping, they often double down on coercion, tighten information controls, and scapegoat political opponents or vulnerable communities. That damages social cohesion and can stoke cycles of protest and repression that reverberate for years. Economically, a leadership distracted by internal disputes will struggle to deliver policy that stabilizes markets or restores investor confidence, deepening hardship for ordinary citizens. Externally, the stakes are immediate. A state that appears divided is harder to negotiate with and harder to deter. Allies and adversaries read signs of discord and adjust their own calculus. Regional proxies and partner militias, which have long been instruments of Tehran's influence, may begin to act with greater autonomy if they sense the center's hand weakening. In such a setting, miscalculation becomes more likely. Local commanders might take provocative actions to secure resources or political advantage, while outside powers might interpret fragmentation as an opportunity to press harder. From the perspective of strategic stability, the key questions are: who ultimately controls the instruments of force? Who decides when and how to deploy them? And how are competing priorities adjudicated? If, for example, military commanders are asserting practical command over external operations while civilian leaders press restraint, that disconnect can produce both limited escalations and unintended consequences. Fragmentation also complicates diplomacy. Negotiating with one faction does not guarantee compliance by another, and the durability of any agreement depends on the capacity of the ruling system to impose and enforce its terms. There are also succession dynamics that intensify what looks like infighting. Revolutionary systems built around charismatic or long-serving leaders face acute stress when the question of who will replace them becomes real. Succession is not merely the appointment of a single person. It is a process that reshuffles networks of patronage, influence, and power. Different factions will promote candidates aligned with their interests, and those jockeying for position can use both public messaging and private pressure to shape outcomes. These contests are rarely clean. They generate rumors, public demonstrations of support, and sometimes outright confrontation. Kiron Skinner has emphasized that the rhetoric of leadership crisis should be weighed against the durable capacities of state in size. Institutions. Even under strain, the core mechanisms of control, security services, surveillance apparatus, and administrative reach are not easily dismantled. That is an important corrective to a simplistic narrative that a fissured leadership automatically implies imminent collapse. States can absorb shocks, adapt, and reconstitute a new equilibrium where a different balance of forces holds sway. The question is what that new equilibrium will look like and what it will cost to achieve. Another factor to keep in mind is the effect of external coercion on internal politics. International sanctions, military strikes, and diplomatic isolation can produce a rallying effect if leaders successfully frame the crisis as an external threat that justifies domestic unity. Conversely, if elites perceive that external pressure has weakened their capacity to control outcomes, they may compete for the scarce resources that remain. The difference between those responses often hinges on narrative control. Who can credibly claim to defend the nation and who appears to profit from conflict? For policymakers and analysts watching from the outside, the temptation is to root for a particular outcome, but the responsible approach is to consider a range of plausible scenarios and the likely consequences of each. One scenario is managed consolidation. Rival factions negotiate an internal settlement. The most powerful institution reasserts primacy, and a new balance of control emerges with limited disruption to governance. Another scenario is prolonged fragmentation. Competing centers of power persist, producing policy incoherence and episodic violence. A third scenario, less likely but of great consequence, is a rapid breakdown of central authority followed by a scramble for control, a scenario that would have catastrophic domestic humanitarian consequences and unpredictable regional spillover. What should be emphasized in assessing these scenarios is the human dimension, political IT. And fighting is not only a matter of elite reputation or influence, it affects the daily lives of millions who face economic distress, restrictive freedoms, and the constant threat of violence. Any analysis that abstracts from these consequences risks becoming an intellectual exercise rather than a serious account of what is at stake. For regional neighbors, a fragmented Iran is not necessarily benign. States that fear Tehran's influence may welcome a reduction in centralized projection of power, but they also worry about the unraveling of command over militias and weapons flows. When proxy groups sense a vacuum, they can act independently, and their actions can trigger cycles of tit-for-tat violence. That dynamic raises the cost of instability for states across the Middle East and beyond. For Western governments, and for the United States in particular, the calculus is complicated. On the one hand, negotiation with a government that is seen as divided raises questions about the durability of any commitments. On the other hand, policies aimed at regime change often underestimate the capacity of security institutions to adapt and the humanitarian toll of abrupt transformation. Effective policy, therefore, requires a nuanced appreciation of how internal Iranian politics operate, an appreciation that looks beyond headlines and considers institutional incentives, elite networks, and the likely second and third-order effects of any external pressure. There is also a moral and legal dimension. Any foreign policy response must consider the laws of armed conflict and the distinction between combatants and civilians. When political turmoil increases the risk to vulnerable populations, external actors have obligations not to intervene recklessly, but to calibrate actions that minimize harm. That is no small task in a